So today we'll primarily deal with section 304. From the point of view of the section, it is not a very nuanced section, it is very straightforward. It has some tidbits that most people do not know about. So I'll be telling you those, and after that I might be reading your irregularities which vitiate the proceeding section. It is just bare act reading fest that is left. Apart from that, conceptual points we have already done with, and our CRPC is substantially complete. Nothing else is left in that. So from the point of view of the exams, we have covered almost the 100% of the syllabus far long ago. But since we have a lot of time left and we are far ahead of the schedule, so I'm interested in dealing with section 304 and some of the sections which require some bare act reading, so that I may explain you some of the few concepts which might escape your grasp. But from the point of view of the exam and even from the practical point of view, these are not the sections which are often asked, but yes, you may include it. It doesn't hurt you to know extra. So section 304 talks about that if the trial is before a court of session and the accused is not represented by a pleader, or if he doesn't have sufficient means to engage a pleader. In other words, he is poor, he cannot afford a lawyer. So in those situations, the court will assign him a pleader at the expense of the state. Alright, so the state government shall bear the expenses of the pleader and he will defend the accused. Right? Then High Court may make rules with the previous approval of the state government regarding the mode of selecting such pleaders, facilities to be allowed to them, and fees to be payable to such pleaders. Why the approval of state government is there? Because primarily it is the executive and legislature, primarily the legislature, who deals with the economic aspects of our state and at the central level. Why? Because since they are directly elected by the people, so they are firstly authorized to control our economic materials, and any question of law or otherwise which have economic fallouts or economic consequences are to be primarily be dealt with legislature, not with the courts. Alright, this is the general rule. Then the state government may by notification direct that from such date as may be specified in the notification under the provisions of section 1, then such rules shall apply to any class of trials before other courts in the state as they apply in relation to trial before the court of session. So subsection 3 takes it one step further and says if the state government wants, it may issue a notification and may extend the beneficial provisions of section 304 to other classes of courts also. Which are the other classes of the courts? You have the courts of magistrate, it can be even the high court, courts of magistrate, court of session, etc. So generally what happens is that the state government shall bear the expense if the trial is before the court of session primarily. But subsection 3 says by notification state government may extend the beneficial provisions of section 304 towards all the other classes of courts as it may thinks fit in relation to any class of trials, no matter what type of trial is there, session, summons, warrant, etc. It depends on the state government. But as far as the trial before court of session is concerned, mandatorily a pleader has to be assigned if the accused is not represented by a pleader, or if he cannot afford a pleader. Alright. So this obligation to provide legal aid to the indigent accused does not arise only when the trial commences. I'll tell you because this comes from the case law, but arises right since the accused is produced before the nearest magistrate as required by section 57 of the CRPC and article 22(1) of the Constitution. On what basis I am saying that? Khatri versus State of Bihar, when I was explaining you your investigation chapters, I did include all of this. If you remember that the requirement of pleader does not start just from trial. It starts the moment the accused is presented before the magistrate, right? However, generally the accused has to apply. Let us suppose he is not given a pleader, so he has to apply to the court of session for a lawyer if he is not appointed a lawyer. Then in that situations, what happens practically is that the court concerned forwards this application to the legal aid center, and a lawyer is appointed, or there are myriads of methods available with the courts to appoint a lawyer. But at the point is this, that the lawyer has to be given to an accused who is not represented by a pleader. Alright, and this is a very beneficial provision, so it must be liberally construed, right? Now I come to the main point that is there. In the case of, you might have heard this from me, in Sukdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh, AIR 1986, Supreme Court, page number 1991, I told you about a situation that where in a situation the accused has not been provided a lawyer and a case has been tried by a court of sessions. Then in those situations, the entire trial would be set aside because it would be considered a violation of Article 21 of the Constitution that was held in the Sukdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh. So because of such rigorous interpretation by the Supreme Court of Section 304 of the CRPC, this provision should be construed mandatorily, right? But of course, we cannot stretch it beyond its scope also. Like you remember the case of Ajmal Amir Kasab versus State of Maharashtra, where a situation arose, a technical point was raised that at the time of confession, the Kasab was not given a lawyer. Supreme Court said yes, he was not, but he never intended to apply for a lawyer. The way, tone and tenor of his confession itself showed that he was not interested in getting a lawyer. It was only later that he realized that he committed a folly and now he might be sent to gallows. So that is why Supreme Court said that since that thing did not prejudice him and he was confessing in a very voluntarily manner and his confession was true, then in those situations, the mere fact that the lawyer was not appointed to him at the stage of recording confession under 164 would not itself vitiate the proceedings. Because the whole purpose of recording confession is what? It should be voluntary, it should be true. That is it. And the lawyer is there to make sure that the accused knows of his rights. But the tone and tenor of Kasab itself showed that he knew very well what he was doing and what he was saying was true and it was voluntary. So merely because the lawyer was not appointed at that stage, it is not a incurable irregularity. Alright. But if after that stage, I'll take a theoretical example. If after this stage, let us suppose Kasab was not given a lawyer and then he was convicted, then in those situations, Sukdas versus Union Territory for Arunachal Pradesh would apply and he would be acquitted and the entire proceeding would be void, right? Because Sukdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh judgment says that it is mandatory that you have to give him a lawyer. If he's not represented, the Supreme Court reassures every single court that your proceeding would be set aside in an appeal. It is the law which binds every single court. So in a trial, it is very mandatory that he should be given a lawyer. That is the only tidbit that is there. Apart from that, the section is very straightforward. It has some constitutional gloss, and generally what Supreme Court says, that power to direct retrial is generally exercisable only in exceptional and rare cases. The demand of justice should be the guiding factor for exercise of such power. The interest of the society cannot be ignored while protecting the right of the accused to a fair trial. Thus, in a case of a bomb blast in a bus resulting in death of 4 persons and injuries to many others, the court found that the trial stood vitiated for being held without providing legal aid to the accused. However, it was held by the Supreme Court that the incident being 14 years old and the accused being in custody ever since his arrest, it cannot be a ground to acquit him. Therefore, the order for retrial was held to be justified for the reasons of gravity of the offence. But so Sukdas and this Mohammad Hussain versus State provide us with two situations. Combined reading and your Muhammad Ajmal, Muhammad Amir Kasab together give us a picture that how section 304 would apply. My personal view is that in major offences, the offences which are grave, the Supreme Court would generally see, it will not mechanically apply the dictum of Sukdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh, but it would rather see what is the gravity of the offence, and then it would come to a conclusion whether in a fact of the given, whether in the given set of facts, should I acquit him or should I order a retrial. And my personal view is that the Supreme Court would rather go in the favor of retrial in the cases where the offences are grave, but where the offences are petty and minor in nature or punishable for the period of less than 7 years. It is my considered view and it is my submission that generally Supreme Court would say that retrial in this case would amount to failure of justice, and I'd rather say that he should be acquitted by reading the law of Sukdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh, which provided for acquittal in this case. Just because Sukdas was couched in such a wide terms, I myself had some doubts regarding that, because Sukdas actually used these words that no matter what the offence, the accused will be acquitted. I never agreed with the dictum, and later when I studied more, I read Muhammad Hussain versus State and Muhammad Ajmal, Muhammad Amir Kasab versus State of Maharashtra. Both are the judgments of section of year 2012. So in both those situations, Supreme Court clarified in greater detail that generally they are to be provided a lawyer, and if a trial has been held without providing them a lawyer, then the proceeding shall be vitiated. This question is certain. The answer to this question is certain, that it is not a curable irregularity. If in a sessions trial, a person is tried and convicted without his lawyer, then this is not a curable irregularity. It cannot be cured by the virtue of section 465. Remember this. So proceedings will be vitiated, that is certain, if the trial has been done. But whether the accused will be acquitted in the appellate proceedings or an order for retrial is to be given, then Sukdas actually says that he should be acquitted. But later Supreme Court judgment says, like Muhammad Hussain versus State, it was decided in 2012, AIR 2012 Supreme Court, page number 3860. In that, Supreme Court said that looking at the gravity of the offence, the order for retrial would be justified, not the order of acquittal. So my considered view is that you should, as a judicial aspirant or a practice aspirant, rather see what is the gravity of the offence and then to come to a conclusion. So you should rather opt with retrial order rather than acquittal. Of course, if you are representing the accused, you will always argue from the point of view which favors the accused. But know this, if the offence is very grave, then the court will not apply the dictum mechanically of Sukdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh. It would rather order retrial. But the answer to this question is certain. If at the time, if accused is convicted at a trial before the court of session and he is not provided a lawyer, then in those situations, the proceedings shall be vitiated. Yet, what will happen after proceedings will be vitiated is a question which depends on facts and circumstances of the case. Generally, it is my view that in the case of grave offences, the order for retrial would be given. Of course, I rely on Muhammad Hussain versus State. But also keep one extra thing in mind. It doesn't mean that if a lawyer is being provided by the state, Then the accused, let us suppose he knows about the dictum of Sukdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh or several other judgments, and he thinks, okay, so if I do not get a lawyer, it means the proceedings can never come to culmination. It can never terminate. It will always be fatal, and it will be incurable irregularity if at all I do not have a lawyer. So if the accused deliberately avoids, if the offer has been given to appoint him a lawyer and to provide him a lawyer, and yet he refuses, he says, no, I have read a case law and I think that it will protect my interest if I do not have a lawyer, because then the proceedings of the court will be vitiated and either the order of retrial would be given or either the order of acquittal will be given, and I'll keep on doing that. I'll keep on refusing the appointment of lawyer. Then in those situations, if the offer of a lawyer is given ever and the accused refuses to have a lawyer, then in those situations it will not be a fatal irregularity, because it is the choice of the accused to not be represented by a pleader. Alright, so do not think that if the accused decides to misuses his liberty, then he can get away with it. He cannot. And one more thing is that if the accused does have sufficient means, then he cannot claim free legal assistance of a lawyer at the expense of the state, particularly so when he has already engaged a defense counsel of his choice. So the accused cannot say that first I'll go and appoint the most expensive lawyer possible and then say that now the state will pay for it. This also cannot be done. It is what fees has to be paid, who will be appointed, that is determined by the rules as framed by the High Court with the approval of the state government, and the appointment of the council shall be in accordance with those rules, and the fees will also be in accordance with those rules, and it will be the court, of course the court which is trying the offence, who will appoint such a lawyer. Alright, so one cannot say that I have a right to choose my lawyer under 303 of the CRPC, which specifically says that a person accused of an offence before a criminal court or against whom any proceedings are instituted may of right be defended by a pleader of his choice. Then he might be reading section 303 and 304 together and think, if a pleader of my choice is not given, then in those situations I may refuse a lawyer and insist that either appoint Harish Salve or appoint some other great lawyer who can get me acquitted. Then answer is no. This is not the way the law works. The law works that it is primarily the discretion of the court that which lawyer will be appointed, and in most cases it is the lawyer who belongs to that district who practices before that court. Generally it is that lawyer which is appointed. Alright, so the foul play cannot be done of these provisions. So I think I have done with these minor points, and what else is there? I don't think anything extra is there. Just keep in mind that principle which I explained to you, because in investigation when I explained to you that if the confession is recorded and the lawyer is not present, that itself will not vitiate the proceeding. It will be seen whether it prejudices the accused or not. Alright, keep that in mind. The dictum of Ajmal Amir Kasab versus state. Alright, I have already given you, and I also explained to you in investigation chapters when I was explaining you section 164 of the CRPC. So that is primarily done. I think I should explain you one or two other illustrations. I should give you some more illustrations so that you can understand properly, because my primary objective is to make sure you understand the scope of this provision. So in a case, what happened that an accused in a sessions trial applied to be provided a particular lawyer at the state expense under section 304 CRPC, but he had also appointed another lawyer to defend him. Alright, so what did the High Court say in this case? In this case, High Court said that when the accused is capable of engaging a lawyer of his choice, then court would not deny him of his right to appoint his own lawyer. Alright, the court will not deny him of his statutory and the constitutional right to appoint the lawyer of his choice and being represented by a lawyer of his choice. Of course, it has been not only been upheld by many Supreme Court decisions, such as reference of Madhu Limai, J&K International versus State Government of Delhi, but several other judgments. But the High Court said that, but when you say that I am indigent, I am poor, and then you want to have a lawyer appointed at the state expense, then in those situations, it is the choice of the court that which lawyer is to be appointed. The accused cannot choose his lawyer at that time. Alright. I'll explain you one more thing. That the right of a legal aid. I'll narrate you another illustration. And it is an illustration mixed with principle. The right of a legal aid to an accused is not limited to the stage of trial. You might be already been knowing that. I reiterated at the start of the lecture. I just narrated this principle at the start of the lecture. Then it arises the moment he is arrested. Alright, the moment he is arrested in connection with a cognizable offence. But the said right is only for representing the accused in the court proceeding. So this right is qualified. It is only for the purpose of representing him in the court proceeding. It will not extend throughout his interrogation in the police custody. So judging by this principle, in Ajmal Amir Kasab case, where an offer of a lawyer was made to him at the time of his arrest, he denied it. He said, I will not be represented by a lawyer of this country, and demanded a lawyer from his home country, that was Pakistan. So Supreme Court held that the action of the accused was nothing but his independent decision, and courts will hold him to that. Therefore, on getting convicted, that he raised an objection that no legal aid was forthcoming from his home country. He made a demand for an Indian lawyer, which was immediately provided. Then it cannot be said in a given situation that his rights under the constitution was denied to him. Of course, even foreigners have some of the constitutional right to legal aid has been extended and found under Article 21 itself, and Article 21 applies to everyone, to the citizens also, to the foreigners also. So we have a catch. So this Kasab guy was trying to be over smart. First he refused a lawyer which was being given to him, that was from India. He demanded a lawyer from Pakistan. Supreme Court said no, we cannot do that. Then when he was convicted, he said, okay, appoint me any lawyer that you can. So the Supreme Court said, in those situations, if we appoint you an Indian lawyer, and merely because we never acceded to your request for appointing a lawyer from your home country, it does not mean that is an incurable irregularity and prejudice to the accused has been caused, or your constitutional rights have been violated. Neither of these conditions exist. Also remember that in this case also one more point was held regarding that confession. Alright, that if accused is denied the appointment of a lawyer and yet proceeds to narrate his confession voluntarily, and the confession is found to be true, then in those situations he cannot then take a defense later at the later proceedings that a lawyer was not there with me while I was giving the confession, while I was narrating the confession before the magistrate under 164 CRPC. Alright, so that is the primarily crux of section 304 of the CRPC. So now we come to section 400. Yeah, there are some minor sections that I need to deal with regarding disposal of property. 451. Order for custody and disposal of property pending trial in certain cases. So 451 is confined to the scope of pending trial in certain cases. So it means that trial has not been disposed of. The trial is yet to be concluded. The trial is yet to be concluded. So for that purpose, you will always resort to 451 if you want to get a vehicle or something else released from Malkhana or something, if it has been seized by the police and later it has been later a confiscation order has been passed by the court. Alright. So section 451 says, when any property is produced before any criminal court during inquiry or trial, the court may make such order as it thinks fit for proper custody of such property pending the conclusion of inquiry and trial. And if the property is subject to speedy and natural decay, or if it is otherwise expedient so to do, the court may, after recording such evidence as it thinks necessary, order it to be sold or otherwise disposed of. So generally, the court will not resort to such an extreme step of selling it or getting it disposed of, but generally what it does, it gives the property back to his owner, to its rightful owner, by ordering him to execute a bond that he will produce it whenever the court requires it to be produced, etc. Let us suppose an object of theft has been seized. ऐसे समझ लीजिए कि there was a thief. He stole a certain amount of ornaments from your house. Alright. Then later the police arrested the thief. It also seized those ornaments which were found. Right? Now these ornaments, by the virtue of law, are to be given to the court, and it will be in the custody of the court. Reading these sections together, 102 of the CRPC with this. So let us suppose those ornaments are very necessary for you, and if those ornaments are with the custody of the courts or in some Malkhana of the police department, then eventually they will degrade over time. Alright, their quality will be destroyed over time. So what will you do in those situations? If in those situations, pending inquiry and trial, you want to get those ornaments released, then under what section do you go? You go under section 451. You apply there to get such property release. So generally what the court will do, it will order you to execute a bond that whenever the court will require you to produce such ornaments, you will produce it, because the identification of those is necessary in order to convict the thief, because all of these things have to be present in the fact and circumstances of the case. Now that is primarily a matter of IPC and your Evidence Act, but to tell you in a nutshell, it has to be shown that what property was moved by the thief and whether it was moved dishonestly, and and further whether the seizure of those ornaments actually belong to you because you have initiated the FIR. Now there are myriads of circumstances which may arise. So your interest, so that your interest is not suffered in a court of law, the legislature has actually made this provision under 451 that in certain cases where you as an owner or the possessor of a property, whatever you may be, you can be owner of the property, you can be a possessor of the property. So in those situations, you may apply under 451 to the court to have that property to be given back to you. So explanation provides you that the property includes any kind of property or document which is produced before the court or which is in its custody, or any property regarding which an offence appears to have been committed or which appears to have been used for commission of offence. So weapons can also be given back, but generally they are not given back because they are necessary for identification, several other things, but they can be generally given back. Firearms or knife which has been used to commit a murder, those can be also be given back. So whatever property that is custodial legis, that is in the custody of law, custody of the court, can be given back if the trial is pending, inquiry or trial is pending, it is not concluded. So what do you do when the trial is concluded? You apply under 452 when it is concluded. In a nutshell, this section is not that important. You need to know just the bare act provisions that are there. But in a nutshell, the courts have mandated, the Supreme Court has mandated that procedure for disposal should be exercised expeditiously and judiciously. The court should pass an appropriate order immediately where the article's custody is generally not required, and the articles whatever has been seized by the police and later granted to the custody of the court are not to be kept for a long time at a police station, and in any case not for more than 15 to 30 days. The court suggested the following procedure. Of course, I am talking about the Supreme Court in the case of Sundarbhai Ambalal Desai versus State of Gujarat, AIR 2003, Supreme Court, page number 638. So Supreme Court said that the power under 451 should be exercised expeditiously and judiciously, so it would serve various purposes. Namely, first, the owner of the article would not suffer because of its remaining unused or by its misappropriation. So इसका एक illustration दे दूँ. You might have seen so many cars just corroding daily, and police officers are generally neglecting it, and they are being exposed to elements as if they are some scrap piece of iron. So in order to avoid those sort of situations, because if you do not take proper care and maintenance of your car and expose it to elements without actually using it, then it will be exposed to rust, and eventually it will start depreciating. It will start being it will corrode to such a level that it will become unusable, or it could happen that it could be a very expensive ornament. Let us suppose gold has been seized by police and it is in the court custody. So what if somebody misappropriates it? What if somebody steals it? Because it has happened. There was this case in Tort that gold had been seized in the proceedings under violation of gold. There was this prohibition that you cannot bring certain amount of gold without the clearance from the custom authority. So there was this person who did brought it. So later it was seized, and during the proceedings, one of the constables who seized it actually stole the entire amount of gold from the custody of Malkhana, and actually in legal terms it is actually called Malkhana, which we'll actually call it, what will be the proper term for it, from the judicial warehouse. That will be the proper term in English, but in practice you will always find the term Malkhana being thrown around quite a lot, so you need to be exposed to it. So what that police officer did is that he stole that gold amount from the judicial warehouse or from the place of custody. So when that person actually applied to have his gold returned, they all found that the gold has been stolen, and the constable ran away to Pakistan. So that was a very problematic instance, and it kept on happening. There were many such instances. So Supreme Court took notice of that and said that that generally these articles should be returned to the owner, so that it avoids misappropriation as well, right? So the first principle that the Supreme Court narrated, that the owner of the article would not suffer because of its remaining unused or by its misappropriation, as that guy suffered whose gold was removed from the custody of the court, and later the constable ran away to Pakistan and said nothing can be done, and state could also not be liable in those situations, because what was done then in that case the state had sovereign immunity regarding that. When I'll come to Tort, I'll explain that case in detail, but I digress. Coming to the second point, the court said that the court or police officer would not be required to keep article in safe custody. Then that is the second principle, that additional burden upon the court or the police would be reduced. Third is, if proper panchanama before handing over the possession of article is prepared, that can be used in evidence instead of its production before the court during the trial if necessary, and the evidence could also be recorded describing the nature of the property in detail. So the court said that rather than producing the property itself again and again, a proper panchnama should be prepared before handing over the property to its rightful possessor, and that panchnama can be used as an evidence rather than calling for the property itself, right? So Supreme Court made the evidentiary rules regarding it very easy, so that needlessly parties, both prosecution and the accused and the owner of the article, should not suffer. Fourth was that the jurisdiction of the court to record evidence should be exercised promptly, so that there may not be further chance of tampering with the article. So the court which requires that article to be produced in evidence should start his evidentiary proceedings. And where does it start? It starts by the trial, so that needlessly you do not need to have an article for unduly long period of time. Or if a panchnama is prepared before trial, you can of course in those situations avoid the production of property altogether. Then the Supreme Court suggested that the procedure for disposal of seized articles and currency notes, vehicles, seized liquors and narcotic drugs, and suggested how do you dispose of them, etc. Because this case primarily crossed over to your NDPS Act as well. So in this case what happened, it directed the magistrate to pass the appropriate orders immediately, so that articles are not kept for a long period of time inside the place of custody, and also mandated to the High Court that keep a proper supervision over the subordinate courts, so that they make sure that unnecessarily the articles are not kept in custody for a long time, so as to cause their corrosion or expose them to the risk of misappropriation. So I think that was it regarding 451. Now I'll come to 452. Now it is about where the trial has been concluded. So 452 says, when an inquiry or trial in any criminal court is concluded, the court may make such an order as it thinks fit for the disposal by destruction, confiscation or delivery to any person claiming to be entitled to the possession thereof. So what can court do? It can dispose it of, it can destroy it if it so wants, confiscate it or deliver it to any person entitled to its possession thereof, or otherwise of any property or document produced before it or in custody or regarding which an offence appears to have been committed, or which has been used for commission of any offence. So primarily you need to focus on these words, that trial has concluded and court can make following orders. It can dispose it of, it can order its destruction. In what situation can it order its destruction? If let us suppose a defamatory matter has been published, then the court may order that all the defamatory material that has been published is to be burned or disposed of or to be destroyed. It can order for confiscation. Then what is in which situations it can order for confiscation? Let us suppose a revolver has been recovered which is not licensed, which has been obtained in violation of Arms Act. So the court can order its confiscation. If the drugs has been recovered or if illicit liquor has been recovered, it can order its confiscation. Those are the means available to the court. Or delivery to whom? To the rightful owner who is entitled to the possession. Possession and ownership are not to be confused. Ownership is higher than possession, but it could be evident on the given fact and circumstances of the case that the person may be entitled to possession but he is not the owner of it. So it depends upon some of the sort of contractual matter. That is why the legislature has used the term possession thereof. It has not used the word owner. To give you a short illustration, I mean it will not be relating to movable property. In fact, I'll relate it to a movable property only. So imagine a hire purchase agreement. So in a hire purchase agreement, you have this option that after giving all installments, you can apply it to become an owner of it. Till then, you are only entitled to possession as a rentee. So in those situations, what can happen is that even though the owner of the property is someone else, yet the person who was paying under the hire purchase agreement for the possession of those goods as a rentee, he may be granted the possession. I'll give you another illustration relates to immovable property. It will be a bit simpler, because if you do not understand the nuances of sale purchase agreements and hire purchase agreement, it could be difficult to understand. And in fact, the reducing the terminologies of these civil laws to simple concepts is also quite difficult, because it might expose you to some unnecessary confusion which I do not want to cast. So imagine a case that of course it does not exactly apply, but I'm only giving you for the sake of imagination to know the difference between ownership and possession. If you are an owner of property and you give it on rent to a tenant, so at that time, till the time the person is giving rent, he is entitled to possession. You are the owner, but at that time of rent, his particular property that you have given to him on rent, you are not entitled to possession at that time, even though you are the owner. At that time, it is the tenant who is entitled to possession, even though he is not the owner, because under the agreement, he has obtained the right to possession for giving a certain amount of money to you, right? Of course, your ownership is higher, you can exclude him after the expiry of the agreement, and several other things can happen. But I want to just emphasize why the legislature has used the word possession here. It has used the word possession here only because the legislature wants to make sure that whoever is entitled to rightful possession, either under agreement or as an owner, he should be given the possession of that property or that document. It can also happen that a mortgagee is entitled to possession of certain documents. The mortgager is not under the mortgage deed. So in those situations also, if let us suppose fraud or forgery or offences against the property is subject matter of a criminal trial, then in those situations also, it would be the mortgagee who is entitled to possess those documents under the mortgage deed who will be entitled to possess those documents, not the mortgager, even though title deeds may actually belong to him. So that has to be seen. That will be seen according to the facts and circumstances of the case. So that is why the legislature has used the word possession, not the word owner. Then second, we come to the second clause. An order may be made under subsection 1 for delivery of any property to any person claiming it to be entitled to possession thereof, without any condition or on condition that he executes a bond with or without sureties to the satisfaction of the court engaging to restore such property to the court if the order made under subsection 1 is modified, set aside in an appeal or revision. So the court is saying, let us suppose opposite party goes into appeal or revision and the order is set aside or modified, then in those situations you have to execute a bond either with or without surety to restore such property to the court, just in case it is set aside. Or the other option is that the court may decide not to impose a condition at all. The Court of Session may, instead of making an order under subsection 1, direct the property to be delivered to the Chief Judicial Magistrate, who shall thereupon deal with it in a manner under 457, 458 and 459. Alright, we will deal with those sections as well. Then, subsection 4 says, except where the property's livestock is subject to speedy and natural decay, or where the bond has been executed, an order made under subsection 1 shall not be carried out for 2 months, or where the or when an appeal is presented till the appeal has been disposed of. You need to mark these words 2 months because it will be asked in prelims, or when the appeal is presented till the appeal is decided. So be very particular that the order shall not be put into execution till 2 months, or where the appeal, if the appeal has been presented till the appeal has been disposed of. Then what are the exception to this prohibitory clause? This 2 months in appeal proceedings does not apply if the property is livestock or is subject to speedy and natural decay. Let us suppose a large group of vegetable is there, and if you keep it for a long duration, it may rot. Then in those situations the court is empowered to sell them if it so wants. Or if the court has ordered a person to execute a bond with or without sureties, then in those situations also the property can be returned to the rightful person, and in those situations your limit of 2 months and your appeal limit does not apply. Alright, but in a given situation, if the court decides that I need to grant property to somebody without a bond has been, without execution of any sort of bond, then in those situations what will happen is that the court needs to wait for at least 2 months, or if the appeal has been presented, till the appeal has been decided. If the court wants to grant the property to its rightful possessor before the expiry of 2 months, then in those situations he should order such person who wants the possession of the property to execute a bond either with or without sureties. Alright, because it binds him to present it to the proper court. Then subsection 5 is there. It says in this section, the term property includes, in the case of property regarding which offence appears to have been committed, not only such property as has been originally in possession or under the control of any party, but also any property into which the same may have been converted, exchanged, and anything acquired by such conversion, exchange, whether immediately or otherwise. Let us suppose somebody steals a gold statue from your home and actually gets it melted and converts it into a gold bar. So this section is only clarifying that the original gold statue which has now been converted into a gold bar by that particular thief, it has to be returned to you. Alright, so an objection cannot be taken that the gold statue is now irrecoverable. Whatever that statue has been converted into, or whatever amount for that statue has been exchanged for, that will be returned to you. Alright, so we'll move on to the next section. The next section is your section 453. Payment to innocent purchaser of money found on accused. When a person is convicted of an offence which includes or amounts to theft or receiving stolen property, and it is proved that any other person bought the stolen property from him without knowing or having a reason to believe that the same was stolen, and that any money has on his arrest been taken out of the possession of the convicted person, the court may, on the application of the purchaser or on the restitution of the stolen property to the person entitled to the possession thereof, order that out of such money a sum not exceeding the price paid by such purchaser to be delivered to him. So the conviction need to be had on theft or for receiving stolen property, right? And if, let us suppose, an innocent purchaser has by mistake purchased such property which was subject of theft or stolen property, then in those situations the accused who has now been convicted for an offence, he has to, if any money has been recovered, then he has to return that amount of money to the innocent purchaser. Alright, you might be remembering section 357 also provides that in a given situation a certain amount of fine can be given to innocent purchaser also. For that purpose, look at section 357D. Alright, so it is a very beneficial provision, section 453. You need to read it with section 357D as well. So in those situations where certain amount of property has not been recovered from him and the property has been restored to the rightful owner, then the innocent purchaser who had actually purchased that property by mistake without knowing that the property was subject to theft or it was actually obtained, it was actually a stolen property. So in those situations, whatever payment is recovered from the convicted person, it could be recovered to that innocent purchaser, alright, whoever that may be. Now we come to section 454. Any person aggrieved by an order made by a court under section 452 or 453 may appeal against it to the court which appeals ordinarily lie from the convictions of former court. So if a court of magistrate has given an order under 452 or 453, you appeal to what? Court of session. On appeal, the appellate court may direct the order to be stayed pending disposal of the appeal, or may modify, alter or annul the order or make such any further orders as may be just. So it's very straightforward. The powers referred to in subsection 2 may also be exercised by the court of appeal, confirmation or revision while dealing with a case under the order referred to in under subsection 1 was made. So just a tidbit that I like to explain to you is that generally a notice to the affected party should be given before passing an order for the return of seized property under this section, so as to have an opportunity of hearing that side who has to return the seized property. Let us suppose a property has been returned to some person who was claiming to be entitled to its possession. So generally what the practice mandates is that a notice has to be given to that person who is having the possession of that property, so that his interests are not prejudiced and so that he can also be heard on a given set of facts. Alright, just know this, that there is a requirement of notice, but it is only in those situations where the property has actually been granted by a lower court to any person who was claiming to be entitled to possession. So that is why you go on appeal. Let us suppose a magistrate court has given that, then you go to the appeal to the court of session. So in those situations, what the court of session is mandated to do is that before giving a substantial order or before setting aside the order of the magistrate, let us suppose court of session believes that I will set aside the order of the magistrate. So before coming to any of these steps, he must give the notice to the person who is actually in the possession of the property. Alright, so that he may be heard properly, and if at all he satisfies the appellate court that he is actually entitled to the property, the appellate court may even dismiss the appeal for the possession which has been preferred in the appeal. If a person is saying that the magistrate shouldn't have granted possession to that other person, it should have the property should have been granted to me instead, and he appeals to the sessions court, then in those situations your sessions court may first give notice to that person, your person to whom the property has been granted by the magistrate court, and inform him that this appeal has been preferred before me. Do you have something to say? Because I may grant an order where the property which has been given to you by the magistrate may be set aside, and I may order the property to be restored to this other person. So if you have something to say, appear before me and state your cause. So this person may appear before the court of session. He may tell or explain his grounds to the court of sessions that I am actually the one who is entitled to this property, I am its rightful owner, I am its rightful possessor, etc., etc., and the person who is appealing before you is not entitled to that possession of property. So in those situations, what may happen is either the appellate court agrees with this person, or he may disagree with him. Alright, if he disagrees with this person, then the appeal will be granted. If he agrees with this person to whom he has given notice, then the appeal will be dismissed. That is the only thing that is there, nothing else. Destruction of libellus or other matter. Section 455. On a conviction under 292, 293, 501, 502 of the Indian Penal Code. So your 292 and 293 primarily deals with your pornographic material, and 501 and 502 deals with your libellous material which has been published. The court may order destruction of all copies of things in respect of which the conviction was had and which are in custody of the court or remain in the possession or power of or remain in the possession or power of the person convicted. So whatever is within the custody of the court is to be destroyed, or the court may also order the destruction of those properties which are in possession and power of the person convicted, as far as it relates to your pornographic material or your libellous material. Court may in the like manner on a conviction under 272, 273, 274 or 275 of the IPC order food, drink, drug or medical preparation in respect of which conviction was had to be destroyed. Alright, in proper case it should be destroyed only. Then also notice that this is an enabling provision. It is not a mandate. Not in all cases the court is required to mandatorily give an order for destruction of these materials. It is an enabling provision because the word may has been used. So if the court wants, it may, and if it doesn't see any reason to do, if it doesn't see any reason to order destruction of a particular property, then it may refuse to do so as well. Then power to restore possession of immovable property. Now first of all, you immediately rush to the proviso and mark the word 1 month. It can be asked in prelims. That's it. Now I'll read the section. When a person is convicted of an offence attended by criminal force, show of criminal force or by criminal intimidation, and it appears to the court that by such force or by show of force or intimidation any person has been dispossessed of his immovable property, the court may, if it thinks fit, order that the possession of same to be restored to the person after evicting by force, if necessary, any other person who may be in possession of such property. Alright, so if the conviction is under these provisions and the court believes that some person was evicted from immovable property because of threat or intimidation or by the show of criminal force as punishable under IPC, various section of IPC. Criminal force is defined under section 350 of the Indian Penal Code, and criminal intimidation is defined under section 503 of the Indian Penal Code. So if any person by the virtue of these intimidation or by the show of force or by criminal force is actually dispossessed of his immovable property, the court may order the possession of the same to be restored to its rightful possessor. Now keep in mind that that this court is not deciding the title, it is deciding only the issue of possession. If the opposite party believes against whom the order of possession has been passed, it can also approach the civil court and say that I am the rightful owner, I have the title to this property, and I should be given the possession, not the person to whom the criminal court has given the possession. Until the time civil courts has not decided, of course the order of the criminal court will have force, but keep in mind that this section does not decide title, it decides only the possession. Provided that no order shall be made by a court for more than 1 month after the date of conviction. So order has to be made within 1 month. Where the court trying the offence has not made an order in the subsection, the Court of Appeal, confirmation or revision may, if it thinks fit, make such an order while disposing of the appeal, reference, revision as the case may be. Alright, fair enough. You know what are the revisional courts, you know what are the courts of appeal. Court of confirmation is the High Court. Where an order has been made under subsection 1, the provision of section 454 shall apply in relation as they apply in relation to an order under 453. So you can also appeal against the order of those courts which have which has given the possession to some other person. You have the right to appeal, or some other person whose rights are affected by the virtue of this order under 456, they may also apply for appeal, not necessarily the person who has been convicted. his relatives may also apply for appeal, his descendants or heir may apply for appeal. They may think that the subordinate court or the particular court who has given the order under 456 has given it under misconception of fact, and the order is patently illegal, and the possession which is it has granted to some other person is not entitled to those possession. Alright, any myriad of grounds can be taken. No order made under this section shall prejudice any right or interest or in such movable property which any person may be able to establish in a civil suit. So of course the path to a civil suit is always open, even if the criminal court or appellate criminal court decides against you. You can always approach the civil court to decide on the question of title. Alright, and the title of ownership will defeat possession if where the person to whom possession has been given is not entitled to possession. Alright, ownership is the highest title of possession in a sense. Procedure by police upon seizure of property. So you know where the police seizes property under section 102 of the CRPC. It can seize bank accounts also, but it cannot seize immovable property, because seize implies physical possession. Alright, the immovable property can be attached, cannot be seized. Whenever seizure of property by any police officer is reported to a magistrate under the provision of this code, and the property is not produced before a criminal court during inquiry or trial, the magistrate may make such an order as he thinks fit respecting the disposal of such property or the delivery of such property to such person entitled to possession thereof, or if such person cannot be ascertained respecting the custody and protection of such property. So this position applies where there is neither inquiry or trial, or neither it has been concluded. Of course, if the inquiry or trial is not there, the question of its conclusion does not arise. If it was pending conclusion, section 451 will apply. If it was concluded, section 452 would apply. But 457 is about those situations where such property is not at all produced before such a criminal course, where inquiry or trial was pending. It was brought before the magistrate, and magistrate is not carrying out any inquiry or trial. If he was, then 451 would apply in those situations. But since he is not, and since it is not the court which is carrying out the inquiry or trial, legislature has told the magistrate that how would you deal with those situations. So the magistrate may order disposal of such property. It can order it to be disposed of in such a manner as he thinks fit, or it may order it to be delivered into safe custody, or it may order to be delivered into the possession of a person which the magistrate thinks is entitled to such property. If the person so entitled is known, the magistrate may order the property to be delivered to him on such conditions as the magistrate thinks fit, and if such person is unknown, the magistrate may detain it and shall, in the case, issue a proclamation specifying the articles of which such property consists, and requiring any person who may have a claim thereto to appear before him and establish the claim within 6 months from the date of such proclamation. So if it is known, so it is very easy, you can straightforward deliver it into his possession. But if the person is unknown, the legislature asks the magistrate to think, if the magistrate thinks fit, and it is also an enabling provision, the magistrate can also have a recourse to that situation, that it may issue a proclamation, and it may order that I am issuing a proclamation, and a person, whoever is entitled to possession of this property, can come before me and apply for his claim. If I at all find that his claim is valid, I might grant him the possession of the property. If not, then in those situations I may either resort to its custody, or I may even order it to be disposed of if I as a magistrate thinks fit. Alright, so I'll give you an illustration that in a case what happened, that a tractor was seized from the possession of one person. the legal heir of the registered owner claim possession of the tractor. It was held that the proceedings under 457 are summary in nature. You need to be very sure that this is not an elaborate proceedings of trial which are going on. These are summary proceedings. 451 to your 459 are summary proceedings. It means that elaborate inquiry or elaborated procedure is not envisaged. You will not weigh and inquire evidence in great detail, etc., etc. You will just see things over a prima facie level and come to a conclusion as expeditiously and as justly as possible. These are summary proceedings. So it was held that the proceedings under 457 are summary in nature and are not meant to determine the title of the property. Then in those situations, if the party which has applied under 457 for the possession of property and his claim to possession has been refused, can always go to the civil court to establish his title. Alright. So that is why I am giving you an illustration that these are very summary matters. These are very not very elaborate matters that are dealt with by CRPC. Mostly they are not even asked in the exam, and rarely they are asked, and if they are only confined to the sections. The question doesn't come that what is the nature of the property or what is the nature of the proceeding. These type of questions are not there. Of course, for the practice purpose you need to know everything. So for practice purpose I am explaining to you that these are summary proceedings. Elaborated inquiries are not envisaged under these sections. So I think this is primarily dealt with. Now I come to another point, that what is the next section that is to be dealt with in this case. We are dealt with primarily 457. Now we come to 458. If no person within such period 6 months establishes his claim to such property, and if a person in whose possession such property is found is unable to show that it was legally acquired by him, the magistrate may order by order direct that the property shall be at the disposal of state government and may be sold by that government, and the proceeds of such sale shall be dealt with in such a manner as may be prescribed. An appeal again shall lie from the order of the magistrate, as it may lie in the appeals from conviction. So appeal lies in this case. So primarily what I want to tell you here is, do not think that the magistrate will mandatorily order it to be sold and keep it at the disposal of state government. It is again an enabling provision. Magistrate may even order its custody. So why the proceeds of the sale shall be dealt with in such manner as may be prescribed? Actually what happens, if let us suppose after a span of few years the magistrate or the court concerned comes to find out the true owner, and the owner makes a grievance before court that my property was sold without any notice to me. In those situations grave injustice has been caused, and now that property is not even traceable. So in those situations what can happen, that whatever proceeds of the sale, that is amount of money that has been obtained, shall be given to him. Alright. And 459 deals with your power to sell perishable property. Just keep in mind that there is a limit of 500 rupees here. If the person entitled to possession of such property is unknown or absent, and the property is subject to speedy and natural decay, or if the magistrate to whom seizure is reported is of the opinion that the sale would be for the benefit of the owner, or if the value of such property is less than 500 rupees, the magistrate may at any time direct it to be sold, and the provision of 457 and 458, as nearly as may be practicable, apply to the net proceeds of such sale. It means the amount, whatever amount that has been recovered, if later you come to find the true owner, you may give it to him. And 459 is primarily dealing with those situations where the property is perishable in nature, right? Like let us suppose fruits have been seized, vegetable has been seized, some eatable goods have been seized, etc., or some goods which have the tendency to rot after a period of certain weeks have been seized. Agricultural produce has been seized. These are the things which are envisaged under this definition. Alright, to summarize primarily the things that when these proceedings are initiated under 457, 458 and 459, the magistrate has following options to him. He may pass an order regarding disposal of property or deliver it to the person entitled to possession subject to such condition as he thinks fit, or in absence pass an order for its custody or protection. He may issue a proclamation if he so wants, and he can even order a person to appear before him and establish his claim. If the property is perishable in nature, he may order it to be sold, and if the court finds that whatever proceeds have been obtained and later it finds the true owner, it may give the proceed of that sale to the rightful owner who has been able to establish his claim. So generally think that it is not a mandatory provision, these are enabling provision. By enabling I mean that these powers are available to the magistrate if at all they want to have recourse to such proceedings, because you may see that word may has been used, and strictly speaking in the context of 457 and other provisions which comes after it, 457 to 459 all inclusive. So since these are enabling provisions, it doesn't mean that the magistrate has to do one of the following things. It can have recourse to any measure or any of the measures that he thinks fit, which are available to him under 457 or 459 as the case may be, if it deals with a perishable property. He is not mandated to immediately issue a proclamation or resort to some extreme situations or to have an elaborate trial. Keep in mind, these are summary proceedings. An elaborated trial is not envisaged. The proceeds of the sale, whatever are obtained, if let us suppose the property has been sold, then in those cases the proceeds of the sales are to be returned to the rightful owner. Keep one more principle in mind, that the title is not decided by the criminal court. Criminal courts are merely deciding a small issue of possession. Since the proceedings are summary in nature and question of title cannot be gone into, it is the civil court jurisdiction which will have primacy in this case. So the civil court will decide that who is entitled to its title, who has the proper title, and who is entitled to its possession. So if a person who is aggrieved by such order, even after appeal, he may apply for a case in civil court, and he may be able to claim such property on the basis that he is the owner of such property. Alright. Often what happens that the vehicles are seized by the police officer, and you will often see these vehicles being subjected to rust and corrosion. So generally what happens is that the mandate of law is that you need to return these vehicles as soon as possible, but unless and until the aggrieved person applies to the court, and the process in the court is also very tardy, then in those situations what happens is that these properties suffers erosion. So what happens generally, that the magistrate may even order sale of these properties, and whatever proceeds of it are there, they are to be returned to the rightful claimant. But if, let us suppose, a very expensive car has been seized and the magistrate erroneously has passed an order of possession to some other person who is not the owner, but the magistrate thinks he is the owner. Let us suppose that person has played fraud upon the court because the car was so expensive. Let us assume it was a Ferrari. So the magistrate, by the virtue of deception practiced upon him, granted the possession of that property to that third person. And on the appeal, when the rightful owner applies for appeal that he is actually the true owner, his appeal is dismissed, let us suppose due to whatever causes. In those situations also, the rights of rightful owner are not extinguished. The rightful owner can still go inside a civil court and decide the issue of ownership and obtain an order of possession and custody in his favor and get the decree executed and obtain the property from that person. And in this case, the civil court's judgment will extinguish this possessory power that has been granted by the criminal court to that person. Alright. So this is a small issue where the civil court jurisdiction and your criminal court jurisdiction will overlap. Always remember, criminal court is only deciding the issue of possession here, and that too in a very summary manner, not in a very detailed manner. Alright. So primarily when I come to your irregular proceedings under 460 and 461, I think we have dealt with 463 when I was dealing with investigation. Your 164, when I was dealing with section 164, I dealt with 463 also. When I was dealing with charges, I dealt with section 464 also. And section 465, I have been constantly dealing with throughout the procedure, because that is how you are supposed to read section 465, because every single procedure will come into play now, whether it's curable or incurable, etc., etc. So that is why you have already completed one of the most complex areas of law, that was 465, throughout the reading of the code, whether it was curable, whether it was not curable. I have explained it throughout the code, which proceedings are curable, which are not curable. So I will just do the reading of section 460. 460 provides that irregularities which will not vitiate the proceedings. So this question is often directly asked in the prelims. What are the irregularities which do not vitiate the proceedings? The moment you see that sort of question, you immediately think of section 460. And when the question comes and irregularities which do not vitiate the proceedings, you apply for section, you remember section 461. So if any magistrate not empowered by law to do any of the following things: A, to issue search warrant under section 94, B, to order under section 155 the police to investigate an offence, C, to hold an inquest under 176, D, to issue process under 187 for the apprehension of the person within his local jurisdiction who has committed an offence outside the limits of his jurisdiction. You know, under 187 the magistrate concerned is the judicial magistrate first class. E, to take cognizance of an offence under clause A or B under subsection 1 of 190 if a magistrate who is not empowered to take cognizance of an offence. Let us suppose the second class judicial magistrate not empowered by chief judicial magistrate takes cognizance of an offence under A or B. So in those situations it is an incurable irregularity, it is a curable irregularity. It will not vitiate the proceeding. F, to make over case under subsection 2 of 192. Let us suppose he was not empowered by the High Court or the CJM concerned to transfer the proceedings. Of course, High Court empowers a magistrate to transfer proceedings under the High Court rules, and CJM empowers under section 192. And G, to tender a pardon under section 306. H, to recall a case and try it himself under 410. I, to sell a property under 458 and 459 erroneously in good faith. Mark the word good faith. Does the thing, his proceedings shall not be set aside merely on the ground of not being so empowered. Keep one thing in mind, that merely because irregularities will not vitiate the proceedings and you as a magistrate happen to commit a fundamental error falling within any clause of A to I, yet if good faith was not there, with your eyes wide open, you are aware that you are not empowered to do any of the following things, yet you commit such an act, yet you violate these provisions, whatever they may be, then section 460 will not be able to help you. Your irregularities will be vitiated. Why? Because good faith is lacking. And what is good faith? Whatever is done with due care and attention. If something is not done with due care and attention, then that is not good faith. And if you are aware about the situations that you are not empowered as a second class magistrate to take cognizance of offence under section 190 clause A, B, then in those situations your order will be vitiated. Keep that in mind. And now that depends on myriad of factors as well. But the point that I am trying to make is that 460 will not come to your help if you are not acting as a magistrate in good faith. If your eyes are wide open and you know that I am not empowered to grant pardon, and you have granted pardon, let us suppose a case has been committed to the court of session, right? Case has been committed to the court of session. You are a chief judicial magistrate. Chief judicial magistrate is empowered to grant during a pardon during investigation, inquiry or trial, right, at any stage. But if the case has been committed to the court of session, the chief judicial magistrate cannot grant a pardon. It is only the court of session at that situations which can grant a pardon, not the chief judicial magistrate. So you as a chief judicial magistrate, if you have granted an order of pardon, and so in that situation, because you lacked any sort of jurisdiction to do such a thing, section 460 will not come to your aid, because your eyes are wide open that you do not have a jurisdiction to do such a thing, because the moment the case is committed to the court of session, the magistrate can do nothing else further. Now the case is entirely within the domain of the court of session. It is the court of session who will decide whether to grant pardon or not. So you cannot grant pardon at that stage if you are a CJM, if the case has been committed to the court of session. Yes, of course, if the case was before you, the case has not yet been committed, the matter is between the investigation, you have granted a pardon, then that is a different scenario. But keep this in mind, erroneously in good faith is the qualifier of section 460. If with your eyes wide open you see that you do not have a jurisdiction, you act carelessly, you act with negligence, you act recklessly, and act without due care and attention, and without good faith and in a bona fide manner, then in those situations section 460 will not come to your aid. In those situations also departmental proceedings will be initiated against you as a magistrate by the High Court. Now section 461 says, if any magistrate not empowered in law in this behalf does any of the following things: attaches or sells property under section 83, these irregularities ipso facto will vitiate the proceedings. There is no question about it. Attaches and sell the property under section 83. Issues a search warrant for a document parcel in custody of postal or telegraph authority, remember section 92 of CRPC. Demands a security to keep peace, 106 of the CRPC. Demands a security for good behavior, section 107, 108, 109, 1010, 110, read with section 117 of the CRPC. Cancels a bond to keep peace. Makes an order for maintenance. Makes an order under section 133 as to local nuisance. You know which magistrates are empowered for that. DM, SDM or any executive magistrate specially empowered by the state government in this behalf. Prohibits an order, prohibits under section 143 the repetition or continuance of public nuisance. You know which authorities are there, executive magistrates, but there is one extra authority who is empowered by DM also. An executive magistrate empowered by DM also can do so, and he can be empowered, that such executive magistrate, DM, SDM or executive magistrate empowered by state government or DM can prohibit repetition or continuance of public nuisance. So if he is not so empowered and if he issues an order under 143, then his order shall be void. Makes an order under part C, D of chapter 10, that is relating to your 129, 132 that I covered earlier, 129, 130, 131, etc. Takes cognizance of an offence under clause C of subsection 1 of section 190, that is cognizance of it on his own knowledge. Then tries an offender. Executive magistrate cannot try an offender. If he tries, you know what's in store. It will be quashed. Tries an offender summarily. Alright, tries an offender summarily. Passes a sentence under 325 on the proceedings recorded by another magistrate, decides an appeal, calls under section 397, that it means the revisional proceedings, revises an order passed under section 446, his proceedings shall be void. So if the court of magistrates decides to sit on appeal or revises an order, then his proceedings shall be void. Or whatever circumstances under which are given under 461 are absolute in nature. Alright, there is no qualification of prejudice or all that. If it happens to fall under this section 461, if let us suppose the magistrate was not empowered, it doesn't matter whether he lacked good faith or not, or every other circumstance is irrelevant. All that will be considered is whether his case falls under section 461 clause A to clause Q. If at all it does fall, then his proceedings shall be void. If let us suppose an executive magistrate is granting an order of maintenance, even though his order is very good, even though no prejudice has been caused to any person, even though everything is fine, even though he acted in good faith, his order shall be void. Alright. If let us suppose the magistrate tries a case which is triable by the court of session, he was not so empowered, his proceedings shall be void. Why? 461 clause L. These are absolute foundations. These cannot be swept aside by the court, swept aside by any magistrate. Alright. These are very binding provisions. Now I come to section 462. No finding, sentence or order of criminal court shall be set aside merely on the ground that the inquiry, trial or other proceeding in the course of which it was arrived as passed took place in a wrong sessions division, district, subdivision or local area, unless it appears that error has in fact occasioned a failure of justice. So it means that territorial jurisdiction is generally not a very good ground of setting aside the proceedings. So generally you cannot take an objection of territorial jurisdiction, that a particular court does not have territorial jurisdiction and hence the proceedings should be set aside. Let us suppose the court has given a judgment, you go into appeal and now you are saying that the court which tried me did not have the territorial jurisdiction to entertain the matter. So if the court sees that on merit you have not been prejudiced and there has been no case of failure of justice, in those situations what will happen? In those situations the judgment order shall be upheld, notwithstanding that particular sessions division or district court did not have territorial jurisdiction over you. Alright. But in a given situation, if let us suppose you wanted to call witnesses in your favor which you weren't able to call because your case was being tried into a wrong sessions division, or because of the lack of territorial jurisdiction you could not obtain those sterling evidences which you could have obtained had your case has been tried in the proper sessions division or the proper court where your territorial jurisdiction lies, in those circumstances there can be a case of failure of justice. Alright. And if that is proven on record, then such order shall be set aside. That is the only nuance that is there. Now 463 has already been dealt with, 464 has also already been dealt with, 465 I have been dealing with throughout the CRPC, whether it's curable, whether it's not curable, on what circumstances whether it will be curable, right? And in the matters relating to sanction also I have dealt with it. So primarily it is done. See, primarily all of you, CRPC is primarily complete. So right now whatever I am telling you is primarily belonging to the domain of academics and domain of minor matters of practice. As if not much nuanced things are contained here, like I talked about section 451 to 459. It relates to disposal of property. If it's summary in nature, neither an elaborate inquiry, neither an elaborate procedure need to be had, then that is a very trivial matter. Yes, 304 of the CRPC was important thing, but then again this thing can be understood by the virtue of the constitutional provision on with a bare reading of the section itself. Remember that generally under section 3 304 in a sessions trial, if a lawyer is not appointed to an indigent person and its rights are violated, that is an incurable irregularity. Now what will happen after that incurable irregularity, that I have decided, that I have explained to you at the start of the lecture. Alright, now it can lead to retrial, and the proceedings or whatever the trial has been proceeded with shall be quashed, it would be set aside, and the order for retrial would be given. Or in a given case, if the court sees that there is no ground for obtaining the charge, it may even, agreeing with the ratio of Sukdas versus Union Territory of Arunachal Pradesh, acquit the person. But this will not happen in the case of grave offences. Alright, so that was it primarily. Now we'll see what else topic I'll take tomorrow.